Okay, fine, I hear your cries and calls. I'm gonna show you how to master every weapon in U12, including the new tools. Let's go. Now quickly, before we get into video, if you don't want to end up like this dude right here, then you should totally subscribe to the channel, because like 90% of you are not subscribed to my channel, and it's very annoying. So subscribe if you watch the content. See you guys there. Okay, so to start off with our first weapon, we have the well-loved Dagger. Now, one thing I will say about the Dagger is it is a pure offensive weapon and is your best option when going for pure stealth runs. Now, what I tend to do with these videos, I'm going to just run you down quickly, is that I like to do one good tip for the weapon and how you should generally use it. That's really all you need to know. The rest of it is just practice and figuring it out. I have other videos and other videos coming up on tips on how to actually just get better at general combat in the game, but that's really what we're going to go for. So the Dagger. The Dagger is best used for stealth, I've found, so if we spawn this dude right here, you can see the Dagger is really good for getting in there quick and quietly. I did not mean to stab him. But yeah, you can really like slash the back of the legs, go for the back of the head, which I just poked him by accident, or you can even grab the net and slice. Now, that's what I would say the Dagger is best at. You can also use it as an aggressive fighting tool. Now, reverse grip with the Dagger is actually one of the only weapons I would recommend using, as you can just get better thrusting power, but that's only if your accuracy is good. Now you can see, the problem with reverse grip is your accuracy goes down, whereas if you have front grip, you can get them right in the eye. And it really, really is really fun. Now with the Dagger, unfortunately, it's not going to pierce leather too great. It can, but it takes a few tries and a real good thrust. Sometimes it just doesn't, so you really want to be going for those weak points on the neck, the eye, and possibly the legs and hands. Now, a great thing about the Dagger that I highly recommend doing with all these small weapons is if an enemy's holding their weapon, I did not mean to grab her hip, if the enemy's holding their weapon in this hand, you can grab the hand, jab it with the Dagger, and they should drop it. Once they've dropped it, they should actually fall like this, and you can quickly kill. She didn't die, because I think I've got extra health on the enemies. But yeah, that's how I recommend using the Dagger. Now, our next weapon is the kind of useless skinning knife. Now, another thing that I forgot to mention with the Dagger that you can do with this one as well is throwing. And throwing is quite good with the skinning knife, because if you hit them in the head with it, like that, it's an instant kill. So I highly recommend using the skinning knife like that. Another thing, don't bother with slashing with it. Like, it's going to come off most things and not do much damage. You really just want to get in there and go for the face. Sometimes these hitboxes on these things are a little dodgy, especially with these open face helmets. You just got to be careful with that. But if you can get in there, you're pretty much guaranteed a kill if you can get them right in the face. Now, it's really not that good otherwise. The slashing is kind of tragic. You can get the jugular if you're fast enough, or you can even go for the bottom of the legs, but again, it's not going to do a whole lot. You really just want to be going for the neck and the head, and that's how I would use the skinning knife. Now, moving on to the swords category, and our first sword is the Antique Greatsword. Now, this thing is beautiful. This thing is basically your lowest tier greatsword, but it still packs a punch. Now, the great thing about the Antique Greatsword, it's actually not too bad to one hand if you can get your swings wide. You can really get some nice swings. That's without easy dismemberment on. That just shows you, if you get accurate with your swings, it's pretty damn good. And then two-handing it, of course, is perfect as well. There is no reason you shouldn't practice both, and you can actually flick between both. Now, currently there's this weird two-handing bug. That's getting fixed in 12.1 very soon. But unfortunately, yeah, right now, two-handing can stick like this. So, just be warned of that. And otherwise, here's what I would do with the Antique Sword. Now, the Antique Sword has a wide blocking range, so I would definitely use that. And it also has quite a decent guard. So when you're blocking with it, I would tend to kind of cover as much as your body as you can, either like this, or if you decide to reverse grip it, like this, because reverse grip, you can really use on a greatsword quite well, because it's a heavy weapon. You want to have that power to draw and swing quickly, and those kind of uppercut swings can really work if you get the right angle. And if you knock them down, you can finish them like that. Now that kind of goes for all greatswords. So let's move on to our next greatsword. And our next greatsword is the Claymore. Now this is kind of the most powerful greatsword I feel like in the game. It has the biggest handle, a fantastic guard for bashes. The whole idea of the Claymore is that it's huge, so you can really use your range with the Claymore. That's really what you want to keep an eye on with these greatswords, is you have range. Look at that distance. If he was using his normal weapon, I can hit her from here and she can't even get close. And I could just finish her off. And yes, that dismemberment is beautiful. So I highly recommend it. And yeah, I can just double check for you guys. Dismemberment is disabled right now, so this Claymore really just is that good. It really is. Now again, the main thing I would keep an eye on with the Claymore is make sure you're using the guard to bash, to keep enemies back. If an enemy gets too close, you're not going to want to swing really, because you're going to end up flat blading it, or whatever, or they could get too up in your face. So a quick bash with the guard, and you can finish them off in whichever way you like. And that is how I would use the Claymore. So up next on our list we have the Greatsword. Now the Greatsword is, I think, the tier 2 version of the Claymore, and you would basically use it pretty much the same way. You know, you have a nice guard, although not as nice and not as damaging as the Claymore's one. This thing actually works really well in that reverse grip stance I showed you, like so. The cutting power of this weapon isn't actually that good, so you really want to be putting some force behind it where you can. Now, I'm not actually all that accurate with the Greatsword because I just don't really like it, so I don't use it that often. But when you do get accurate with it, you can do some damn good damage. Now, I feel like this thing's actually better with the piercing than it is with slashing, and that's funny for a Greatsword. But yeah, you don't want to be one-handing this at all, it just doesn't have the maneuverability, and the slashing isn't great. Honestly, I just don't like this weapon. If you like it, that's up to you, but I feel like it flat blades a lot. It just doesn't feel great at all. It doesn't do a lot of damage. So if you are going to use it, I do recommend just using thrust technique. Keep yourself back and guarded. Block, thrust. And another way you can block and thrust is if you come up like this. So when they come to attack, you can block up into this angle and thrust, and that should finish the kill. I'll try and show you an example of that now. So we're going to go in slow motion just to demonstrate. Just so you can kind of see. You go up and thrust. And that should do the job very nicely. Moving on to our next weapon. So our next weapon is the one and only longsword. Now this thing is absolutely beautiful. I love this thing. It's one of my favorite weapons in the game, and I'm going to show you why. So first of all, the longsword can be one-handed or two-handed, which is what's great about it, and it's great for thrust and slash, and it really does cut so much nicer than half the weapons in the game because of its weight. Now its thrusting potential actually isn't that great. It does bounce off leather armor quite easily, but if you can get the neck, it hits hard. Now, there's a lot of ways to use the longsword. I like to use it as a counter-attacking weapon. So for example, if we spawn an enemy, I'll show you again in slow motion how I like to use it. Very similar to the greatsword in that way. Whereas I like to wait for an enemy to attack, come up, and get that thrust in. And something about that just really feels nice. Because it's quite a long range weapon, you want to use it in that defensive way. If you use the longsword with full advantage on its defense, you can really keep yourself from taking any damage while dealing out a good amount. So, if you keep the block up and wait for the attack to come in, block up into the head, and I took no damage. So that is how I would recommend using the longsword. And one thing to note about the longsword is that if you really want to get good with it, make sure you're interchanging between one and two-handed, because one-handed is just as good as your two-handed option in certain cases. Moving on to our next weapon. Now here we have the war sword, which is honestly one of my favourites in the game alongside the longsword, and the reason is it's basically a longsword that's better at thrusting. The slashing is very good, it does do the damage when you need it to. Again, you can one-hand this weapon, and the guard actually has some real bash potential. But the thing that I love about this weapon so much is its thrusting is pretty good. If you can get past that leather like that, the longsword can't really do that too often. Whereas this weapon just really can just stab straight through that leather if you put some power behind it. which is rare for one of these swords, so I think that puts it slightly above the longsword in power, although I don't think it handles as nicely as the longsword. It does handle nicely. The one-handed is pretty good, and the thrusting is fantastic. So yeah, that's what I would recommend with this sword, is just focus on the thrusting aspect of it. Really get used to using your one-handed thrust, so if you have to come up for a slash, then you come back, if I could ungrip with that bug, and then thrust forward. The range you can get on a thrust is huge if you do it properly, so outranging is a great key thing with this weapon. Moving on to our next weapon. And our next weapon is the weapon I personally think has the best handling in the game, and that is the Reverend sword. Now, why is the Reverend sword so good? Well, it handles one-handed like a dream. There is no problem with that kind of handling. Without me having a guard as well, there's no drag on the weapon really. There's a slight bit, but not much. And it also means the weapon's more sleek and agile, which I just love. Now, the two-handed mode is also really fast and good potential for damage, but the main thing about it is the slashes are actually better than the other two weapons, which I actually think is great. If you like a slashing weapon rather than a thrusting weapon, this does both really well, and I think that's something you really want to keep an eye out for. It's just how well these things slash. So the Reverend sword is again another one I'd recommend switching your grips with. Maybe not as much reverse grip, but absolutely using one and two-handed. And you can even flip it round for a stab in the back for some easy maneuvering. And yeah, you can really flip this weapon pretty easily. So, it's lightweight, it's powerful, and that's all I have to say about this thing. It is my favourite weapon in the game, and you can see why. Moving on to our next set of weapons. So our next weapon is the Baby Reverend sword, and that's the Antique sword. The Antique sword is a primarily thrusting weapon, and it is fantastic if you want to be switching up your grips really quick. You can do that with the Antique sword really well. Now, the reason I say it's primarily thrusting is it is based off a Gladius, and historically Gladius were designed to thrust, so I feel like this is exactly what you want to use this for. Now, it's very good for going for the jugular. This weapon really can just slice a throat or cut a head off very easily, but as well, it's really good for getting a counter, coming up, flipping the guard, and stabbing. And that kind of maneuverability of being able to like slash, grab, and stuff, and just throw this thing around a bit, adds so much potential to its movement, and honestly is one of my favourite weapons to play around with when I do some slow-mo stuff, because the actual movement is amazing. So I do recommend interchanging hands and flipping up guards when you can, as well as using it to counter. If you can get a cross counter and then in, like that, that's a dead enemy, my friend. So, for example, this kind of attack you want to be blocking, like that, bring the weapon out, and you can get a thrust in. Now, depending on where you land is down to your accuracy, but I would end up aiming for the chest, the head, or the stomach. And that's all you need to know for this beautiful antique sword. So for our next weapon we have the short sword, and now the short sword I would always pair with a shield. I think that's its best kind of pairing. I feel like with a round shield you can kind of block and stab and slash and really get that kind of quick action in. And I feel like the short sword is kind of a jack of all trades. It's good at everything but not great at anything, really. It's got some decent stab on it, it's got some decent slash, but overall there's just weapons that do other things better. The only thing I think this really has going for it is if you want an all-rounder with some great handling, this thing is definitely where it's at. Now this is one I would never really recommend changing grip. Just keep your slashing round, unless you really need to finish someone off on the ground, and even then, if you need to do that, you can always stab down with this thing. Even though it doesn't get that much power, your reverse grip clearly will allow you to do that better. I do think that this thing is best just left with one hand using a shield, and the other hand using the sword. And I think that's all we need to say about the short sword. It's pretty simple. And our final sword is the riding sword. Now this is a lot of people's favourites, and I can see why. This thing has slash for days. This thing can stab like no other weapon. I just made it look really bad, but it can stab really damn well. I think this thing is one of the best weapons. The handling is just flawless on it. There's not much time where you're really going to struggle handling this thing. And like I said, the slashing is beautiful. Now, it doesn't decapitate as well as some other weapons, But overall, I think it is generally better than the other short swords. Again, you can kind of flip it around. The center of mass is a little bit weirder on this one. I don't think it's as good as the antique sword for kind of movement. But I would say if you really want a good thrusting one-hander, or a weapon to dual wield, this is going to be your weapon. Absolutely. Moving on to the axes. And our first axe is the Northern Axe. Now this thing is a monster, and I'm going to show you a few techniques you can use to make yourself good with it. Now a problem this axe always has is it does get stuck a lot. And I do find that to be a problem. But when you actually do land your hits, this thing can really pull out the stops. I mean, really. But as you can see, it's quite easy to miss. If you don't hit that axe point, it's quite difficult. So I recommend holding the axe a little bit further up, so you can really get your axe head in there. And going for the vertical chops is always a good thing. It struggles a little bit with armor, which is why I'm struggling to get these kills. But it really does do some serious damage when you get in there. And I do like it. Now one thing you can use the axe for, which a lot of these pole weapons can be used for, is to sweep the legs of your enemy. Or knock them down. Now it's quite difficult to get right, but if you do, it's a guaranteed kill. And that is absolutely how I'd recommend using. You can also do the old For Honor pommel bash before coming down on their head with the axe. And that works quite well, so I recommend just making sure you're using the whole weapon here. You've got this whole shaft to block attacks with, so you can kind of block and then come down with the axe. Or you could block and come up with the axe like that. So you have a lot of movement and potential with this thing, which you wouldn't expect for such a large weapon. Moving on to the next axe. And our next axe is my favourite axe, and that's the Bardiche. And the reason it's my favourite is because it has a special handle. And that handle allows for some pretty nasty kills. So I would recommend using this pretty much the same as the Northern Axe, with your kind of sweeping knockdown to kill. I think that really works well. But one thing this weapon really has going for it that the Northern Axe doesn't is this handle up here, that you can almost perfectly direct the axe straight to an enemy's head. So if you really want to play up close, you can block, bash, and kill someone like that. And then you can also dig it right in there. Not to mention, it also has a pierce, so keep an eye for that. I recommend using that pierce, not on here, but maybe if you can get to their face with a good thrust, it does do some damage. So I recommend trying that out at least once. Moving on to our next weapon. And our next weapon is the Lumber Axe. Now the Lumber Axe is the worst axe in the game, in my opinion, behind one other we're going to see soon. And what I would recommend doing with this is really just going for the head. You don't want to go anywhere else, because it will be an instant kill to the head, and you can get some beautiful kills with this thing if you land your hits. It's got a lot smaller radius than most of the axes in the game, so to hit that correctly is going to be difficult. Now I found it goes through armor better than some of the axes, but again, that small area to hit with makes you struggle. So you can also go for the stomach, straight into the head like that, and it really does embed itself nicely. So if you can get used to holding the trigger to slide your hand down the weapon, you can really get some nice kind of big swings. And it's something I definitely recommend getting used to, especially with the fact you can kind of get short range and increase your range as you go. Highly, highly recommend practicing that. Otherwise, I'd just use another axe. Moving on. On our next axe is the axe. Yes, you heard me right. The axe. Now, this axe is really, really fun for close range. It does some good damage. You can really get in there and land some good hits. It can really dig in there as well. Like if you look right all the way in, does some good damage. And I love to do something called axe brawling, which I've seen a few times before, but I think I've coined the term myself about a year ago. If someone else made that up before me, I apologise, but I came up with that myself. Okay, so axe brawling is kind of a thing where you have your hand right underneath the axe, and you can kind of punch with the axe. So if you get two axes, you can go full boxing mode, and you can actually decapitate with this. So let me just try that. It's quite difficult to get right, but if you do, it's not going to work for me this time, because the axe is embedding into their neck instead, but that's okay. you guys can see it could work, and that's all that matters. Moving on to the next axe. And our next axe is the Hatchet. Now the Hatchet I would recommend carrying multiple, and really, it's not that good. It doesn't even kill one shot to the head, so I recommend using it as a throwing weapon. That's how I would use it. I think that's how it's designed to be used as well, as kind of like a tomahawk. I really enjoy using it to throw, pull back out, and then finish. And honestly, that's all I have to say. It's just pretty bad otherwise. As a standard weapon, it's bad. As a throwing weapon, it's absolutely beautiful. And I highly recommend using it that way. Moving on. So for our next weapon, we have the War Axe, and this is the final axe. And this thing is basically your high-end axe. It's very nice. It's got pierce on the back, so I highly recommend using that when you can. If you swing, you can come back with the pierce for a kill. And I think that is one thing you really need to keep an eye on, is that back piercer. You can even use it to kind of stun enemies before you come in with that axe head for their neck or wherever. The only gripe I have about this axe is it doesn't pierce too well. Or like, not pierce, but it doesn't dig in all too well. Like, it doesn't go as deep as the other axes, and I really wish it did. I like the idea of pulling an axe out and it getting stuck a little bit, you know? And maybe that's just a personal opinion, but I do like it. See, it just kind of like scraped down his head there. Not a fan of that. But yeah, you can two-hand this if you really want some extra power, but I really recommend just one-handing it, as it has great decapitation potential. So, main tip with this, the pierce, as I said before. Keep an eye on that, and we'll move on to the spears. Now, for the spears, we only have two, so I'm going to show these off quickly, because they both work kind of the same. We have the boar spear, which is your standard long-range spear. Now, one thing I would recommend with the boar spear is getting used to kind of keeping this back thing, but holding trigger to thrust in quickly. Now, you can go two-handed and just thrust, but it doesn't pierce too well sometimes, if you can't get that power. And one thing I really enjoy using this weapon with is kind of picking people up with it, and you'll see, like this, and then I've got the heavy enemies mod on, so I can't do that, but you guys will be able to pierce and pull them up, and then kind of drop them down. And this thing actually does have some slashing potential too. It can slash if you go for the neck. I think it's one of the best all-rounded weapons, as the actual pole can be used to get a bash in before you come down with the spear. Now, I do find the handling a little strange to use, but once you get the hang of it, you've really got a good weapon here. And if you can use the whole weapon to kind of use for your advantage, you can even get the hang of getting close up with a spear like this, and slashing at necks and piercing, to get the whole use out of this weapon. Now, the last thing I'd recommend is trying out the throwing. Now, I find the throwing really jank in this game. It tends to jolt up when you throw, so you kind of want to throw slightly lower than you would expect. And even then, it doesn't work. It's just, I don't know, something happened with the way the item's throw, and it's just really bad. Like, see that was not going towards his head. I mean, I hit it, and great, but I aimed for his body. So, devs, please fix that, because it's really bad, and it's been in since U10. Thank you. Moving on to our next spear. And our next spear is one designed for throwing, and it still sucks to throw. Devs, fix it. What the hell is that? Like, honestly, what is that? Why does it throw like that? Please fix your shit. It's so bad. Yeah, do you know what? All you need to know about the Javelin is don't use it. If you want to use it as a one-handed spear, go for it. But I really don't recommend using it at all, until the devs fix it. Moving on. Now, our next weapon is the Flanged War Mace. Now, this thing is probably the most overpowered weapon in the game. It hits like an absolute truck. Should almost insta-kill on one hit. And it has a pierce, which a lot of these weapons don't. Which is fantastic for finishing off that last bit of damage. Now, really, you just want to use this as a big bludgeon. I don't really need to explain too much about it. But if I can give you one tip, if an enemy's causing you problems with a shield, go for the legs, and then for the head. And that should do the job. Moving on to our next blunt. And our next blunt is the Sledgehammer / Maul. Now, this thing is basically used the same way. Does a lot of damage, although not quite as much as I would have liked from a Maul. It took 2 hits to kill there, which I wasn't a big fan of. But, again, going for those legs, down onto the head, is a fantastic way to use these. I really enjoy using this thing just as kind of like a executioner's weapon. You feel like a monster when you use this. And honestly, I find it more brutal than the Flanged Mace in some ways. because it's just a big blunt piece of metal on a stick, it just does damage really well. And if you have neck breaking mods, you can kind of sweep enemies to the ground like this, and then golf swing their head and break their neck. Now I'm struggling to do that because I don't have that and I have extra health, but it does work, and it's very, very satisfying. So definitely keep an eye on that. And our last big hammer is the Mallet. Now, honestly, it's not great. It does some damage, but it's just kind of unfun. It's like the unfun Sledgehammer, you know? And I basically use it the exact same way, you know? Just get your hits in where you can. But honestly, there's not much difference to it than the Sledgehammer, so I won't spend much time on this one. And our next weapon is the rock. And our next weapon is the Blacksmith hammer. Now the Blacksmith hammer has a few potentially good things. It does do some decent damage, although not as much as I would like. Sometimes it will kill to the head, sometimes it won't. But the thing that's really fun about this is throwing it. It's gone down there now. But yeah, I would honestly use it as kind of like a nice little quick throwing weapon if you find it. Or if you have it, just boom, grab it back. And it really does their job really well like that. As well as you can use it to bash down the legs before you kill someone. It's actually quite a brutal little weapon, and it does more damage than it used to, so yeah, definitely consider using the Blacksmith hammer. Moving on to our next weapon. Now our next weapon is the Flanged mace, and this thing is basically just your standard one-handed mace. Hits like a truck, has a little pierce on the end that I can demonstrate now, and I would recommend using it like a one-handed, like, giant flange mace that we had before. Just get your quick headshots in. That's all you want to go for with blunt weapons, is just your headshots, because that's how you're going to get your kills. And this thing does hit like a truck. So does our next one. And our next one is the trench mace, which really, again, is just like a slightly less powerful version of the other one. Just a little bit less damage, but I feel like it's also faster and more maneuverable, so you can really get those beautiful swings in. It's a little bit more accurate if you want to be going for those, and that was some real damage. So yeah, apart from that, another thing you can use it for is the kind of bash, although it doesn't do a whole lot of damage unless you hit the head, and then you can come round with a swing. But to be honest, that's all I have to say about the trench mace. Now moving on to our exotics, we have the wrist blade. Now the wrist blade, in my opinion, is actually not that good of a weapon. You don't get much defense. The only thing you've got is offense, and even then, like, your range is like this. It's not very close, like, it's not great. But we'll show you how to use it effectively. So what I would always do is go for slicing the neck, or up in the chin, like that. I feel like that is the best way to do it. If you're poking, it can work. But honestly, I feel like you get way more accuracy with uppercuts like this. And it really does do well. Now, another thing you can use it for is going for people's arms or legs. I did not mean to grab the hip, that is a mod, and you guys won't be able to do that. Let me retry that. If you grab the arm while they're holding a weapon, you can stab right in there, and they will drop their weapon just like the dagger, and then you can go straight in for a stomach jab if you're accurate enough. Clearly I'm not. Flip them, and then into the back of the head. And you can kind of just practice that kind of stuff. I mean, that was a little bit sloppy off me, but you get the idea. Moving on. Now our next weapon is the dual blade staff. Now no one ever uses this, and people use it wrong. People use it like a sword kind of weapon. I actually recommend using it like a spear. And I recommend actually one-handing this thing, because if you can get good at the division of labour between back end and front end, you can actually kill two enemies very quickly. Like here, and then, well, you see I missed. Well, you see I missed again. But yeah, you can really get some good damage with that, and it has a lot of potential. It also has a whole blocking area up here, so you can really kind of, if you can get up here, you can block, bring down, bring up, bring around, and you can kind of get used to that, as well as, honestly, just it being really fun and fancy. If you can get good at the kind of back and forth of using both ends of this thing, then it is one of the most fun weapons in the game. But it definitely needs to rework. Moving on to our final exotic. Now our final exotic is the Rapier, and one of my favourites in the game. I like to use it in a crossguard stance like this, where you have your wrist bent over your body, so you've got your whole body blocked, so you can kind of block, thrust. You can also use it like this and kind of block, thrust, but really you want to be standing sideways, keeping your body side, keeping the Rapier like this, so you can block and thrust, and you want to be going for the neck at all times. Now thrusting is great because you can keep this kind of distance where an enemy can't hit you, and I can just go and they're dead, and it's that easy. Now I don't recommend slashing with this thing. It's going to take you a year to kill someone. I really just recommend getting that side angle and getting in the thrust on their weak points. That's something I highly recommend using, is the Rapier. Whole lot of fun. Moving on to our next set of weapons. And our last set of weapons are the tools. I'm skipping bows because I'll do a separate video on ranged weapons. But we have the Hayfork. Now the Hayfork is pretty interesting. It's great for some thrusting stuff, and I actually really enjoy it for being like a slapping tool. It's kind of goofy. Even though it doesn't do a lot of damage, when the enemies are fully interacting with you it will. But it does do some nice pierce damage if you can get it to pierce, which is cool. Although it's not the best tool and probably actually one of the worst, it's a whole lot of fun. Now the next weapon is a completely different story, and that's the Pitchfork. And the reason the Pitchfork's so good is because it's metal. Really, it just outperforms the Hayfork in every aspect. It's a pretty beefy weapon. You can really pick people up and slam them around with it. And honestly, you can actually use this thing one-handed as a pretty good stabbing tool too. So I think as a tool, it's one of the best. It's really fun to use and actually stabs really well. Honestly, I recommend just focusing on blocking and stabbing, and that's all I would use this thing for. It's not really that effective a weapon. None of the tools are, but I'll still cover them now. So the next weapon we have is the Rake, and I honestly don't see how this thing could hit too hard. And it doesn't. I lied, it hits very hard. So you want to go for knocking your enemy down with this, from what I can gather. I haven't used this thing actually as much as some of the other weapons, but if you can knock your enemy down, they're gonna die. I think that is pretty cool. Moving on to our next weapon. And our next weapon is the Pickaxe. Now this thing, I wish it was better actually. It's not bad, it does some good piercing, if you can get the angle correct. But honestly, the angle on the piercing, whoever made this pickaxe, it's bad, bro. It's really bad. Warp Frog, the pickaxe sucks. So, I would like some fixes for this. But if you can get that pierce angle correct, which I'm struggling to do because it's very damn difficult, you can get some good stabs in. But honestly, again, there's just better weapons. I don't recommend the pickaxe out of the tools at all. Now, next we have the hoe, and this thing actually can do some slicing damage. So, it digs in like that. It's kind of like a vertical axe. And honestly, of the tools, this is one of the better ones. You can kind of dig it in there and dig it in there, and it really can do some good damage. And I think it can actually decapitate. I haven't tested it, and I'm not going to spend time trying to do it, but yes, it can, and it's pretty cool. So I recommend going for kind of like a down, up motion, so down, up, down, that kind of thing, to get your heads and body shots in. And moving on to our final weapon. And our final weapon is a brand new favourite for everyone, and that's the Sickle. Now the reason the Sickle's so good is because of that. It really just stabs in so beautifully, and it has a lot of stabbing potential, as well as it can slash pretty well. So, if you can get that angle correct, it will just cut someone's head off. It's quite difficult to do with a tier 1 weapon, but if you have a easy dismemberment on, it will do the job. Now, it's also really good for getting into someone's leg, and pulling them down, and finishing them off. I think it's just the best tool, to be honest, and I highly recommend using this as a sweeping and hacking tool, as well as the pierce. It just has great potential. It's just great. That's all I can really say about it. Highly recommend trying this one out. And that's it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, subscribe, ring that bell, all that good stuff, and let me know if this helped. And let me know if this helps you learn any of the other weapons. Anyway guys, let me know what you want to see next, and I'll see you guys later. In a bit.